Johnny Ludlow, first series by Mrs. Henry Wood. Johnny Ludlow, first series, 1874, consists of 26 short, self-contained stories. Each chapter explores different events, mysteries, and social issues, with Johnny Ludlow either observing or participating. You can enjoy each story individually, making this series perfect for watching one chapter at a time. Part 8, Chapter 15, The Game Finished. The clang of the distant church bell was ringing out for the daily morning service, and Miss Cattledon was picking her way across the road to attend to it, her thin white legs displayed and a waterproof cloak on. It had rained in the night, but the clouds were breaking, promising a fine day. I stood at the window, watching the legs and the pools of water. Miss Devine sat at the table behind, answering a letter that had come to her by the morning post. "Have you ever thought mine a peculiar name, Johnny?" she suddenly asked. "No," I said, turning to answer her. "I think it a pretty one. It was originally French, de Vigna, but like many other things has been corrupted with time and made into what it is. Is that 10 o'clock striking?" "Yes," and the bell was ceasing. Miss Cattledon would be late. It was a regular penalty to her, I knew, to go out so early, and quite a new whim, begun in the middle of Lent. She talked a little in her vinegar way of the world's wickedness in not spending some of its working hours inside a church, listening to that delightful curate with a mild voice, whose hair had turned prematurely gray. Miss Devine, knowing it was meant for her, laughed pleasantly, and said if the many years' prayers from her chamber had not been heard as well as though she had gone into a church to offer them up, she should be in a poor condition now. I went with Miss Cattledon one Monday morning out of politeness. There were 29 in the pews, for I counted them, 28 being single ladies, to judge by the look, some young, some as old as Cattledon. The gray-haired curate was assisted by a young deacon, who had a black beard and a lisp and his hair parted down the middle. It was very edifying, especially the 10 minutes gossip with the two clergymen coming out when we all congregated in the aisle by the door. "My great-grandfather was a grand old proprietor in France, Johnny, a baron," continued Miss Devine. "I don't think I have much of the French nature left in me." "I suppose you speak French well, Miss Devine?" "Not a word of it, Johnny. They pretended to teach it me when I was a child, but I'm afraid I was unusually stupid." "Why? Who can this be?" She alluded to a ring at the visitor's bell. One of the servants came in and said that the gentleman who had called once or twice before had come again. Miss Devine looked up first at the servant, then at me. She seemed to be considering. "I will see him in 2 or 3 minutes, George," and the man shut the door. "Johnny," she said, "I have taken you partly into my confidence in this affair of the lost studs. I think I will tell you a little more. After I sent for Lettuce Lane here, and my impression, as I told you, was very strongly in favor of her innocence, it occurred to me that I ought to see if anything could be done to prove it, or at least to set the matter at rest, one way or the other, instead of leaving it to time and chance. The question was, how could I do it? I did not like to apply to the police, lest more should be made of it than I wished. One day a friend of mine, to whom I was relating the circumstances, solved the difficulty. He said he would send to me someone with whom he was well acquainted, a Mr. Bond, who had once been connected with the detective police, and who had got his dismissal through an affair he was thought to have mismanaged. It sounded rather formidable to my ears, once connected with the detective police, but I consented, and Mr. Bond came. He has had the thing in hand since last February. And what has he found out? Nothing, Johnny. Unless he has come to tell me now that he has, for it is he who is waiting. I think it may be so, as he is called so early. First of all, he was following up the matter down in Worcestershire, because the notion he entertained was that the studs must have been taken by one of the Whitney's servants. He stayed in the neighborhood, pursuing his inquiries as to their characters and habits, and visiting all the pawnbrokers' shops that he thought were at available distances from the hall. Did he think it was Lettuce Lane? He said he did not, but he took care, as I happen to know, to worm out all he could of Lettuce's antecedents while he was inquiring about the rest. I had the girl in this room at his first visit, not alarming her, simply saying that I was relating the history of the stud's disappearance to this friend who had called, and desired her to describe her share in it to make the story complete. Lettuce suspected nothing. She told the tale simply and naturally, without fear. And from that very moment, Johnny, I have felt certain in my own mind the girl is as innocent as I am. Mr. Bond thought she might be, but he would not go beyond that. For women, he said, were crafty and knew how to make one think black was white. Miss Devine, suppose, after all, it should turn out to have been lettuce? I asked. Should you proceed against her? I shall not proceed against anyone, Johnny, and I shall hush the matter up if I can, she answered, ringing for Mr. Bond to be shown in. I was curious to see him also. Ideas floating through my brain of cocked hats and blue uniform and Richard Mayne. Mr. Bond turned out to be a very inoffensive-looking individual indeed, a little man wearing steel spectacles, in a black frock coat and gray trousers. When I last saw you, madam, he began, after he was seated, and Miss Devine had told him he might speak before me, I mentioned that I had abandoned my search in the country and intended to prosecute my inquiries in London. You did, Mr. Bond. That the theft lay among Sir John Whitney's female servants, I have thought likely all along, continued Mr. Bond. If the thief felt afraid to dispose of the emeralds after taking them, and I could find no trace of them in the country, the probability was that she would keep them secreted about her, and get rid of them as soon as she came to London, if she were one of the maids brought up by Lady Whitney. There were two I thought in particular might have done it. One was the lady's maid, the other, the upper housemaid, who had been ill the night of their disappearance. All kinds of ruses are played off in the pursuit of plunder, as we have cause to learn every day, and it struck me the housemaid might have feigned illness, the better to cover her actions and throw suspicion off herself. I am bound to say I could not learn anything against either of these two young women, but their business took them about the rooms at Whitney Hall, and an open jewel case is a great temptation. It is, assented Miss Devine. That carelessness lay at my door, and therefore I determined never to prosecute in this case. Never, in fact, to bring the offender to open shame of any sort in regard to it. And that has helped to increase the difficulty, remarked Mr. Bond. Could the women have been searched and their private places at Whitney Hall turned out, we might or might not have found the emeralds. But I wouldn't have had it done for the Lord Chancellor, sir, interrupted Miss Devine hotly. One was searched, and that was quite enough for me, for I believe her to be innocent. If you can get at the right person quietly for my own satisfaction, well and good. My instructions went so far, but no farther. Mr. Bond took off his spectacles for a minute and put them on again. I understood this perfectly when I took the business in hand, he said quietly. Well, madam, to go on. Lady Whitney brought her servants to London, and I came up also. Last night, I gleaned a little light on the matter. He paused and put his hand into his pocket. I looked, and Miss Devine looked. Should you know the studs again? He asked her. You may as well ask me if I should know my own face in the glass, Mr. Bond. Of course I should. Mr. Bond opened a pillbox. 3 green studs lay in it on white cotton. He held it out to Miss Devine. Are these they? No, certainly not, replied Miss Devine, speaking like one in disappointment. Those are not to be compared with mine, sir. Mr. Bond put the lid on the box and returned it to his pocket. Out came another box, long and thin. These are my studs, quickly exclaimed Miss Devine, before she had given more than a glance. You can look yourself for the private marks I told you about, Mr. Bond. 3 brilliant emeralds that seemed to light up the room, connected together by a fine chain of gold. At either end, the chain was finished off by a small square plate of thin gold, on one of which was an engraved crest, on the other Miss Devine's initials. In shape, the emeralds looked like buttons more than studs. I never knew they were linked together, Miss Devine, I exclaimed in surprise. Did you not, Johnny? Never. I had always pictured them as 3 loose studs. Mr. Bond, who no doubt had the marks by heart before he brought them up, began shutting them into the box as he had the others. Anticipating from the first that the studs would most probably be found at a pawnbroker's. If found at all, I venture to speak to you then of a difficulty that might attend the finding, said he to Miss Devine. Unless a thing can be legally proved to have been stolen, a pawnbroker cannot be forced to give it up. And I am under an engagement to return these studs to the pawnbroker, whence I have brought them, in the course of the morning. You may do so, said Miss Devine. I dare say he and I can come to an amicable arrangement in regard to giving them up later. My object has been to discover who stole them, not to bring trouble or loss upon pawnbrokers. How did you discover them, Mr. Bond? In a rather singular manner. Last evening, In making my way to Regent Street to a place I had to go to on business, I saw a young woman turn out of a pawnbroker's shop. The shutters were put up, but the doors were open. Her face struck me as being familiar, and I remembered her as Lady Whitney's housemaid, the one who had been ill in bed, or pretended to be, the night the studs were lost. Ah, I thought some discovery may be looming up here. I have some acquaintance with the proprietor of the shop, a very respectable man who has become rich by dint of hard, honest work and is a jeweler now as well as a pawnbroker. My own business could wait, and I went in and found him busy with accounts in his private room. He thought at first I had only called in to see him in passing. I gave him no particulars, but said I fancied a person in whom I was professionally interested had just been leaving some emerald studs in his shop. "What is the pawnbroker's name?" interrupted Miss Devine. "James." He went to inquire and came back, saying that his assistant denied it. There was only one assistant in the shop. The other had left for the night. This assistant said that no one had been in during the last half hour, excepting a young woman, a cousin of his wife's, who did not come to pledge anything, but simply to say how do you do and to ask where they were living now, that she might call and see the wife. Mr. James added that the man said she occupied a good situation in the family of Sir John and Lady Whitney, and was not likely to require to pledge anything. Plausible enough, this, you see, Miss Devine, but the coincidence was singular. I then told James that I had been in search for these 2 months of some emerald studs lost out of Sir John Whitney's house. He stared a little at this, paused a moment in thought, and then asked whether they were of unusual value and very beautiful. Just so I said, and minutely described them. Mr. James, without another word, went away and brought the studs in. "Your studs, Miss Devine? And how did he come by them?" "He won't tell me much about it, except that they took in the goods some weeks ago in the ordinary course of business. The fact is he is vexed, for he has really been careful and has managed to avoid these unpleasant episodes, to which all pawnbrokers are liable. It was with difficulty I could get him to let me bring them up here, and that only on condition that they should be in his hands again before the clock struck 12. You shall keep faith with him. But now, Mr. Bond, what is your opinion of all this?" "My opinion is that that same young woman stole the studs, and that she contrived to get them conveyed to London to this assistant, her relative, who no doubt advanced money upon them. I cannot see my way to any other conclusion under the circumstances," continued Mr. Bond firmly. "But for James's turning crusty, I might have learned more." "I will go to him myself," said Miss Devine, with sudden resolution. "When he finds that my intention is to hold his pocket harmless and make no disturbance in any way, he will not be crusty with me. But this matter must be cleared up if it be possible to clear it." Miss Devine was not one to be slow of action, once a resolve was taken. Mr. Bond made no attempt to oppose her. On the contrary, he seemed to think it might be well that she should go. She sent George out for a cab, in preference to taking her carriage, and said I might accompany her. We were off long before Miss Cattleden's conference with the curates within the church was over. The shop was in a rather obscure street, not far from Regent Street. I inquired for Mr. James at the private door, and he came out to the cab. Miss Devine said she had called to speak to him on particular business, and he took us upstairs to a handsomely furnished room. He was a well-dressed, portly, good-looking man with a pleasant face and easy manners. Miss Devine, bidding him sit down near her, explained the affair in a few words, and asked him to help her to elucidate it. He responded frankly at once, and said he would willingly give all the aid in his power. "Singular to say, I took these studs in myself," he observed. "I never do these things now, but my foreman had a holiday that day to attend a funeral, and I was in the shop. They were pledged on the 27th of January. Since Mr. Bond left this morning, I have referred to my books. The 27th of January. It was on the night of the 23rd that the studs disappeared. Then the thief had not lost much time. I said so." "Stay a minute, Johnny," cried Miss Devine. "You young one sum up things too quickly for me. Let me trace past events. The studs, as you say, were lost on the 23rd. The loss was discovered on the 24th, and Lettuce Lane was discharged. On the 25th, those of us staying at Whitney Hall began to talk of leaving. And on the 26th, you two went home after seeing Miss Chalk off by rail to London. And Mrs. Hughes also. They went up together." "Who is Mrs. Hughes?" asked Miss Devine. "Don't you remember? That young married lady who came to the dance with the Featherstons. She lives somewhere in London. Miss Devine considered a little. I don't remember any Mrs. Hughes, Johnny. But, dear Miss Devine, you must remember her, I persisted. She was very young-looking, as little as Sophie Chalk. Harry Whitney, dancing with her, trod off the tail of her thin pink dress. I heard old Featherston telling you about Mrs. Hughes, saying it was a sad history. Her husband lost his money after they were married, and had been obliged to take a small situation. Recollection flashed upon Miss Devine. Yes, I remember now. A pale, ladylike little woman with a sad face. But let us go back to business. You all left on the 26th. I and Miss Cattledon on the 27th. Now, while the visitors were at the hall, I don't think the upper housemaid could have had time to send off the studs by rail. Still less could she have come up herself to pledge them. Miss Devine's head was running on Mr. Bond's theory. It was no housemaid that pledged the studs, spoke Mr. James. I was about to say, Mr. James, that if you took them in yourself over the counter, they could not have been sent up to your assistant. All the people about me are trustworthy. I can assure you, ma'am, he interrupted. They would not lend themselves to such a thing. It was a lady who pledged those studs. A lady? Yes, ma'am, a lady. And to tell the truth, if I may venture to say it, the description you have now given of a lady just tallies with her. Mrs. Hughes? It seems so to me, continued Mr. James. Little, pale, and ladylike. That is just what she was. Dear me, cried Miss Devine, letting her hands drop on her lap as if they had lost their power. You had better tell me as much as you can recollect, please. It was at dusk, said Mr. James. Not quite dark, but the lamps were lighted in the streets and the gas indoors. Just the hour, ma'am, that gentlefolk choose for bringing their things to us. I happened to be standing near the door when a lady came into the shop and asked to see the principal. I said I was he and retired behind the counter. She brought out these emerald studs, touching the box, and said she wanted to sell them or pledge them for their utmost value. She told me a tale, in apparent confidence, of a brother who had fallen into debt at college, and she was trying to get together some money to help him, or frightful trouble might come of it. If it was not genuine, broke off Mr. James, she was the best actor I ever saw in all my life. Please go on. I saw the emeralds were very rare and beautiful. She said they were an heirloom from her mother, who had brought the stones from India and had them linked together in England. I told her I could not buy them. She rejoined that it might be better only to pledge them, for they would not be entirely lost to her, and she might redeem them ere 12 months had passed if I would keep them as long as that. I explained that the law exacted it. The name she gave was Mary Drake, asking if I had ever heard of the famous old forefather of theirs, Admiral Drake. The name answers to the initials on the gold. M.D. They were engraved from Margaret Devine. Perhaps she claimed the crest. Also, Mr. James, added that lady sarcastically. She did, ma'am, in so far as that she said it was the crest of the Drake family. And you call her a lady? She had every appearance of one, in tone and language too. Her hand, she took one of her gloves off when showing the studs, was a lady's hand, small, delicate, and white as alabaster. Ma'am, rely upon it, though she may not be a lady in deeds, she must be living the life of one. But now, who is it? Yes, who is it? Miss Devine, looking at us, seemed to wait for an answer, but she did not get one. How much did you lend upon the studs? 10 pounds. Of course, that is nothing like their value. Should you know her again? How was she dressed? She wore an ordinary paisley shawl. It was cold weather, and had a thick veil over her face, which she never lifted. Should not that have excited your suspicion? Interrupted Miss Devine. I don't like people who keep their veils down while they talk to you. The pawnbroker smiled. Most ladies keep them down when they come here. As to knowing her again, I am quite certain that I should, and her voice too. Whoever she was, she went about it very systematically, and took me in completely. Her asking for the principal may have thrown me somewhat off my guard. We came away, leaving the studs with Mr. James. The time had not arrived for Miss Devine to redeem them. She seemed very thoughtful as we went along in the cab. Johnny, she said, breaking the silence, we talk lightly enough about the finger of Providence, but I don't know what else it can be that has led to this discovery so far. Out of the hundreds of pawnbroking establishments scattered about the metropolis, it is wonderfully strange that this should have been the one the studs were taken to. And furthermore, that Bond should have been passing it last night at the moment Lady Whitney's housemaid came forth. Had the studs been pledged elsewhere, we might never have heard of them. Neither, as it is, but for the housemaid's being connected with Mr. James's assistant. Of course it was strange. You were surprised to see the studs connected together, Johnny. That was the point I mentioned in reference to Lettuce Lane. One might have fallen down, she sobbed out to me, in leaving Whitney Hall. Even two, but it's beyond the bounds of probability that three should, ma'am. She was thinking of the studs as separated, and it convinced me that she had never seen them. True, an artful woman might say, so purposely to deceive me, but I am sure that Lettuce has not the art to do it. But now, Johnny, we must consider what steps to take next. I shall not rest until the matter is cleared. Suppose it should never get on any further. Suppose you are like a young bear, all your experience to come, retorted Miss Devine. Why, Johnny Ludlow, do you think that when that finger I venture to speak of is directing an onward course, it halts midway? There cannot, I fear, be much doubt as to the thief. But we must have proof. You think it was Mrs. Hughes? What else can I think? She is very nice, and I could not have believed it of her. I suppose the sight of the jewels, combined with her poverty, must have proved the temptation. I shall get back the emeralds, but we must screen her. Miss Devine, I don't believe it was Mrs. Hughes. Not believe it? No. Her face is not that of one who would do such a thing. You might trust it anywhere. Oh, Johnny, there you are at your faces again. Well, I was never deceived in any face yet. Not in one that I thoroughly trusted. If Mrs. Hughes did not take the studs, and bring them to London, and pledge them, who else could have brought them? They were taken to Mr. James's on the 27th. Remember, that's the puzzle of it. We must find out Mrs. Hughes, and then contrive to bring her within sight of Mr. James. The Whitneys know where she lives. Anna and Helen have been to call upon her. Then our way is pretty plain. Mind you don't breathe a syllable of this to mortal ear, Johnny. It might defeat our aims. Miss Cattledon, always inquisitive, will question where we have been this morning with her curious eyes. But for once she will not be satisfied. I should not keep her, Miss Devine. Yes, you would, Johnny. She is faithful. She suits me very well. And her mother and I were girls together. It was a sight to be painted. Helen Whitney standing there in her presentation dress. She looked wonderfully well. It was all white, with a train behind longer than half a dozen peacocks' tails, lace and feathers about her hair. The whole lot of us were round her. The young ones had come from the nursery. The servants peeped in at the door. Miss Cattledon had her eyeglass up. Harry danced about the room. Helen, my dear, I admire all very much except your necklace and bracelets, said Miss Devine, critically. They do not match, and do not accord with the dress. The necklace was a row of turquoises, and did not look much. The bracelets were gold, with blue stones in the clasps. The Whitney family did not shine in jewels, and the few diamonds they possessed were on Lady Whitney today. But I had nothing else, Miss Devine, said Helen, simply. Mamma said these must do. Miss Devine took off the string of blue beads, as if to examine them, and left in its place the loveliest pearl necklace ever seen. There was a scream of surprise. Some of us had only met with such transformations in fairy tales. And these are the bracelets to match, my dear. Anna, I shall give you the same when your turn for making your curtsy to your queen comes. Anna smiled faintly as she looked her thanks. She always seemed regularly down in spirits now, not to be raised by pearl necklaces. For the first time her sad countenance seemed to strike Todd. He crossed over. What is wrong, Anna? He whispered. Are you not well? Quite well, thank you, she answered, her cheeks flushing painfully. At this moment Sophie Chalk created a diversion. Unable to restrain her feelings longer, she burst into tears, knelt down outside Helen's dress, and began kissing her hand and the pearl bracelet in a transport of joy. Oh, Helen, my dear friend, how rejoiced I am! I said upstairs that your ornaments were not worthy of you. Todd's eyes were glued on her. Bill Whitney called out bravo. Sophie, kneeling before Helen in her furbelows, made a charming tableau. It is good acting, Todd, I said in his ear. He turned sharply. But instead of cuffing me in next week, he just sent his eyes straight out to mine. Do you call it acting? I am sure it is. But not for you. You are bold, Mr. Johnny. But I could tell by the subdued tone and the subdued manner that his own doubts had been at last awakened whether or not it was acting. Lady Whitney came sailing downstairs, a blaze of yellow satin, her face with flurry like a peony. She could hardly say a word of thanks for the pearls, for her wits had gone wool-gathering. When she was last at court herself, Bill was a baby in long clothes. We went out with him to the carriage, the lady's maid taking at least 5 minutes to settle the trains. And Bill said he hoped the eyes at the windows all round enjoyed the show. The postilion, an unusual sight in London, and the 2 men behind wore their state liveries, white and crimson, their bouquets bigger than cabbages. You will dance with me the first dance tonight? Todd whispered to Sophie Chalk as they were going in after watching the carriage away. Sophie made a slight pause before she answered, and I saw her eyes wander out in the distance towards Bill Whitney. Oh, thank you, she said, with a great display of gratitude. But I think I am engaged. Engaged for the first dance? Yes. I am so sorry. The second then? With the greatest pleasure. Anna heard it all, as well as I. Todd gave Sophie's hand a squeeze to seal the bargain, and went away whistling. Not being in the world of fashion, we did not know how other people finished up drawing-room days, and when Helen Whitney went to court they were drawing rooms. But the Whitneys' program was this: a cold collation in lieu of dinner, when fate should bring them home again, and a ball in the evening. The ball was our joint invention. Sitting round the schoolroom fire one night, we settled it for ourselves. And after Sir John and my lady had stood out well, they gave in. Not that it would be much of a ball, for they had few acquaintances in London, and the house was small. But now, had any aid been wanted by Miss Devine to carry out her plans, she could not have devised better than this. For the Whitneys invited, all unconsciously, Mrs. Hughes to the ball. Anna came into Miss Devine's after they had been sending out the invitations, only 3 days before the evening, and began telling her the names as a bit of gossip. She came at last to Mrs. Hughes. Mrs. Hughes, interrupted Miss Devine, I am glad of that, Anna, for I want to see her. Miss Devine, seeing her, would not go for much in the matter of elucidation. It was Mr. James who must see her, and the plan by which he might do so was Miss Devine's own. She went down and arranged it with him, and before the night came, it was all cut and dried. He and she and I knew of it. Not another soul in the world. You will have to help me in it a little, Johnny, she said. Be at hand to watch for Mr. James's arrival, and bring him up to me. We saw them come back from the drawing-room between 5 and 6, Helen with a brilliant color in her cheeks. And at 8 o'clock we went in. London parties, which begin when you ought to be in your first sleep, are not understood by us country people, and 8 was the hour named in the Whitneys' invitations. Cattledon was screwed into a rich sea-green satin, somebody else's once, with a water lily in her thin hair, and Miss Devine wore all her diamonds. Sir John, out of his element and frightfully disconsolate, stood against the wall, his spectacles lodged on his old red nose. The thing was not in his line. Miss Devine went up to shake hands. Sir John, I am rather expecting a gentleman to call on me on business tonight, she said, and have left word for him to step in and see me here. Will you forgive the liberty? I'm sure it's no liberty. I shall be glad to welcome him, replied Sir John dismally. There'll not be much here but stupid boys and girls. We shall get no whist tonight. The plague only knows who invented balls. It was a little odd that, next to ourselves, Mrs. Hughes should be the first to arrive. She was very pale and pretty, and her husband was a slender, quiet, delicate man, looking like a finished gentleman. Miss Devine followed them with her eyes as they went up to Lady Whitney. She does not look like it. Does she, Johnny? Whispered Miss Devine to me. No, I was quite sure she did not. Sophie Chalk was in white, with ivy leaves in her spangled hair, the sweetest fairy to look at ever seen out of a moonlight ring. Helen, in her court dress and pearls, looked plain beside her. They stood talking together, not noticing that I and Todd were in the recess behind. Most of the people had come then, and the music was tuning up. The rooms looked well. The flowers scattered about had come up from Whitney Hall. Helen called to her brother. We may as well begin dancing, William. Of course we may, he answered. I don't know what we have waited for. I must find a partner. Miss Chalk, may I have the honor of dancing the first dance with you?" That Miss Chalk's eyes went up to his with a flash of gratitude, and then down in modesty to the chalk floor. I knew as well as though they had been behind her head instead of before it. "Oh, thank you," said she. "I shall be so happy." And I no more dared glance at Todd than if he had been an uncaged crocodile. She had told him she was engaged for it. But just as William was about to give her his arm, and someone came and took away Helen, Lady Whitney called him. He spoke with his mother for a minute or two, and came back with a cloud on his face. "I am awfully sorry, Sophie. The mother says I must take out Lady Esther Starr this first time, old Starr's wife, you know, as my father's dancing days are over." "Lady Esther is 37 if she's a day," growled Bill, "and as big as a lighthouse." "I'll have the second with you, Sophie." "I'm afraid I am engaged for the second," hesitated Miss Sophie. "I think I have promised Joseph Todditley." "Never mind him," said Bill. "You'll dance it with me, mind? I can tell him I mistook the dance," she softly suggested. "Tell him anything." "All right." He wheeled round and went up to Lady Esther, putting on his glove. Sophie Chalk moved away, and I took courage to glance sideways at Todd. His face was white as death, I think with passion. He stood with his arms folded, never moving throughout the whole quadrille, only looking out straight before him with a fixed stare. A waltz came next, for which they kept their partners, and Sophie Chalk had enjoyed the luck of sitting down all the time. Whilst they were making ready for the second quadrille, Todd went up to her. "This is our dance, Miss Chalk." Well, she had her share of boldness. She looked steadily in his face, assuring him that he was mistaken, and vowing through thick and thin that it was the third dance she had promised him. While she was excusing herself, Bill came up to claim her. Todd put out his strong arm to ward him off. "Stay a moment, Whitney," he said with studied calmness. "Let me have an understanding first with Miss Chalk. She can dance with you afterwards if she prefers to do so. Miss Chalk, you know that you promised yourself to me this morning for the second dance. I asked you for the first. You were engaged for that, you said, and would dance the second with me. There could be no mistake, on your side or on mine." "Oh, but indeed I understood it to be the third, dear Mr. Todditley," said she. "I am dreadfully sorry if it is my fault. I will dance the third with you. I have not asked you for the third. Do as you please. If you throw me over for this second dance, I will never ask you for another again as long as I live." Bill Whitney stood by laughing, seeming to treat the whole as a good joke. Sophie Chalk looked at him appealingly. "And you certainly promised me, Miss Chalk," he put in. "Todditley, it is a misunderstanding. You and I had better draw lots." Todd bit his lip nearly to bleeding. All the notice he took of Bill's speech was to turn his back upon him and address Sophie. "The decision lies with you alone, Miss Chalk. You have engaged yourself to him and to me. Choose between us." She put her hand within Bill's arm and went away with him, leaving a little honeyed flattery for Todd. But Bill Whitney looked back curiously into Todd's white face, all his brightness gone. For the first time he seemed to realize that it was serious, almost an affair of life or death. His handkerchief up, wiping his damp brow, Todd did not notice which way he was going and ran against Anna. "I beg your pardon," he said with a start, as if waking out of a dream. "Will you go through this dance with me, Anna?" "Yes." He led her up to it, and they took their places opposite Bill and Miss Chalk. Mr. James was to arrive at 9:30. I was waiting for him near the entrance door. He was punctual to time and looked very well in his evening dress. I took him up to Miss Devine, and she made room for him on the sofa by her side, her diamonds glistening. He must have seen their value. Sir John had his rubber then in the little breakfast parlor, Miss Cattledon, Old Star, and another making it up for him. Wanted to see the game played out. I kept by the sofa. This was not the dancing room, but they came into it in couples between the dances, to march round in the cooler air. Mr. James looked, and Miss Devine looked, and I confess that whenever Mrs. Hughes passed us, I felt queer. Miss Devine suddenly arrested her, and kept her talking for a minute or two. "Not a word bearing upon the subject," said Mr. James. Once, when the room was clear, and the measured tread to one of Strauss's best waltzes could be heard, Lady Whitney approached. Catching sight of the stranger by Miss Devine, She supposed he had been brought by some of the guests, and came up to make his acquaintance. "A friend of mine, dear Lady Whitney," said Miss Devine. Lady Whitney, never observing that no name was mentioned, shook hands at once with Mr. James in her homely country fashion. He stood up until she had moved away. "Well," said Miss Devine, when the dancers had come in again, "is the lady here?" "Yes." I had expected him to say no, and could have struck him for destroying my faith in Mrs. Hughes. She was passing at the moment. "Do you see her now?" whispered Miss Devine. "Not now. She was at the door a moment ago." "Not now," exclaimed Miss Devine, staring at Mrs. Hughes. "Is it not that lady?" Mr. James sent his eyes in half a dozen directions. "Which lady, ma'am?" "The one who has just passed in black silk, with the simple white net quilling round the neck." "Oh dear, no," said Mr. James. "I never saw that lady in my life before. The lady is dressed in white." Miss Devine looked at him, and I looked. Here in the rooms, and yet not Mrs. Hughes. "This is the one," he whispered, "coming in now." The one turning in at that particular instant was Sophie Chalk. But others were before her and behind her. She was on Harry Whitney's arm. "Why don't you dance, Miss Devine?" asked bold Harry, halting before the sofa. "Will you dance with me, Master Harry?" "Of course I will. Glad to get you." "Don't tell fibs, young man. I might take you at your word if I had my dancing shoes on." Harry laughed. Sophie Chalk's blue eyes happened to rest on Mr. James's face. They took a puzzled expression, as if wondering where she had seen it. Mr. James rose and bowed to her. She must have recognized him then, for her features turned livid, in spite of the powder upon them. "Who is it, Johnny?" she whispered in her confusion, loosing Harry's arm and coming behind. "Well, you must ask that of Miss Devine. He has come here to see her. Something's up, I fancy, about those emerald studs. Had it been to save my fortune, I could not have helped saying it. I saw it all, as in a mirror. She it was who had taken them, and pledged them afterwards." A similar light flashed on Miss Devine. She followed her with her severe face, her condemning eyes. "Take care, Johnny," cried Miss Devine. I was just in time to catch Sophie Chalk. She would have fallen on my shoulder. The room was in a commotion at once. A young lady had fainted. "What from?" asked everyone. "Oh, from the heat, of course." And no other reason was breathed. Mr. James's mission was over. It had been successful. He made his bow to Lady Whitney and withdrew. Miss Devine sent for Sophie Chalk the next day, and they had it out together, shut up alone. Sophie's coolness was good for any amount of denial, but it failed here. And then she took the other course and fell on her knees at Miss Devine's feet and told a pitiable story of being alone in the world, without money to dress herself, and the open jewel casket in Miss Devine's chamber, into which accident, not design, had really taken her, proving too much in the moment's temptation. Miss Devine believed it. She told her the affair should never transpire beyond the 2 or 3 who already knew it, that she would redeem the emeralds herself, and say nothing even to Lady Whitney. But as a matter of course, Miss Chalk must close her acquaintance with Sir John's family. And, singular to say, Sophie received a letter from someone that same evening, inviting her to go out of town. At least, she said she did. So, quitting the Whitneys suddenly was plausibly accounted for, and Helen Whitney did not know the truth for many a day. What did Todd think? For that, I expect, is what you are all wanting to ask. That was another curious thing, that he and Bill Whitney should have come to an explanation before the ball was over. Bill went up to him, saying that had he supposed Todd could mean anything serious in his admiration of Sophie Chalk, he should never have gone in for admiring her himself, even in pastime, and certainly would not continue to do so or spoil sport again. "Thank you for telling me," answered Todd with indifference. "You are quite welcome to go in for Sophie Chalk in any way you please. I have done with her." "No," said Bill. "Good girls must grow scarcer than they are before I should go in seriously for Sophie Chalk. She's all very well to talk and laugh with, and she is uncommonly fascinating. It was my turn to put in a word. As I told you, Bill, months ago, Sophie Chalk would fascinate the eyes out of your head. Give her the chance." Bill laughed. "Well, she has had the chance, Johnny, but she has not done it. Altogether, Sophie, thanks to her own bad play, had fallen to a discount. When Miss Devine announced to the world that she had found her emerald studs, lost through an accident, she discovered and recovered in the same way, people were full of wonder at the chances and mistakes of life. Lettuce Lane was cleared triumphantly. Miss Devine sent her home for a week to shake hands with her friends and enemies, and then took her back as her own maid. And the only person I said a syllable to was Anna. I knew it would be safe, and I dare say you would have done the same in my place. But she stopped me at the middle of the first sentence. I have known it from the first, Johnny. I was nearly as sure of it as I could be, and it is that has made me so miserable. Known it was Sophie Chalk. As good as known it. I had no proof, only suspicion, and I could not see whether I ought to speak the suspicion even to Mama, or to keep it to myself. As things have turned out, I am very thankful to have been silent. How was it then? That night at Whitney Hall, after they had all come down from dressing, Mama sent me up to William's room with a message. As I was leaving it is at the end of the long corridor. I saw someone peep cautiously out of Miss Cattleton's chamber and then steal up the back stairs. It was Sophie Chalk. Later, when we were going to bed, and I was quite undressed, Helen, who was in bed, espied Sophie's comb and brush on the table, for she had dressed in our room because of the large glass, and told me to run in with them. She only slept in the next room. It was very cold. I knocked and entered so sharply that the door bolt, a thin, creaky old thing, gave way. Of course I begged her pardon, but she seemed to start up in terrible fear, as if I had been a ghost. She had not touched her hair, but sat in her shawl, sewing at her stays, and she let them drop on the carpet and threw a petticoat over them. I thought nothing, Johnny, nothing at all. But the next morning when commotion arose and the studs were missing, I could not help recalling all this, and I quite hated myself for thinking Sophie Chalk might have taken them when she stole out of Miss Cattleton's room, and was sewing them later into her stays. You thought right, you see. Johnny, I am very sorry for her. I wish we could help her to some good situation. Depend upon it, this will be a lesson to her. She will never so far forget herself again. She is quite able to take care of herself. Anna, don't let it trouble you. I dare say she will marry Mr. Everty. Who is Mr. Everty? Someone who is engaged in the wine business with Sophie Chalk's brother-in-law, Mr. Smith. Chapter 16. Going to the mop. I never went to St. John's mop in my life, said Mrs. Todd Italy. That's no reason why you never should go, returned the squire, and never thought of engaging a servant at one. There are as good servants to be picked up at a mop as out of it, and you have a great deal better choice, said he. My mother has hired many a man and maid at the mop. First-rate servants, too. Well, then, perhaps we had better go into Worcester tomorrow and see, concluded she, rather dubiously. And start early, said the squire. What is it you are afraid of? He added, noting her doubtful tone. That good servants don't go to the mop to be hired? Not that, she answered. I know it is the only chance farmhouse servants have of being hired when they change their places. It was the noise and crowd I was thinking of. Oh, that's nothing, returned the pater. It is not half as bad as the fair. Mrs. Todd Italy stood at the parlor window of Dyke Manor, the autumn sun, setting in a glow, tinging her face and showing up its thoughtful expression. The squire was in his easy chair, looking at one of the Worcester newspapers. There had been a bother lately about the dairy work. The old dairymaid, after 4 years of the service, had left to be married. 2 others had been tried since, and neither suited. The last had marched herself off that day, after a desperate quarrel with Molly. The house was nearly at its wits' end in consequence, and perhaps the 2 cows were also. Mrs. Todd Italy, really not knowing what in the world to do, and fretting herself into the face-ache over it, was interrupted by the pater and his newspaper. He had just read there the reminder that St. John's annual Michaelmas mop would take place on the morrow, and he told Mrs. Todd Italy that she could go there and hire a dairymaid at will. 50 if she wanted them. At that time the mop was as much an institution as the fair or the wake. Some people called it the statute fair. Molly, whose sweet temper you have had a glimpse or two of before, banged about among her spoons and saucepans when she heard what was in the wind. Fine mucket, UDB, she said, coming out that their Worcester mop. Having the dairy work to do, as well as her own, just now, the house scarcely held her. We breakfasted early the next morning and started betimes in the large open carriage, the squire driving his pair of fine horses, Bob and Blister. Mrs. Todd at least sat with him, and I behind. Todd might have gone if he would, but the long drive out and home had no charms for him, and he said ironically he should like to see himself attending the mop. It was a lovely morning, bright and sunny, with a suspicion of crispness in the air. The trees were putting on their autumn colors, and shoals of blackberries were in the hedges. Getting some refreshment again at Worcester, and leaving the squire at the hotel, I and Mrs. Todditley walked to the mop. It was held in the parish of St. John's, a suburb of Worcester on the other side of the Severn, as all the country knows. Crossing the bridge and getting well up the new road, we plunged into the thick of the fun. The men were first, standing back in a line on the footpath, fronting the passers-by. Young rustics mostly in clean smock frocks, waiting to be looked at and questioned and hired, a broad grin on their faces with the novelty of the situation. We passed them, and came to the girls and women. You could tell they were nearly all rustic servants too, by their high colors and awkward looks and manners. As a rule, each held a thick cotton umbrella, tied round the middle after the fashion of Mrs. Gamp's, and a pair of pattens whose bright rings showed they had not been in use that day. To judge by the look of the present weather, we were not likely to have rain for a month. But these simple people liked to guard against contingencies. Crowds of folk were passing along like ourselves, some come to hire, some only to take up the space and stare. Mrs. Todditley elbowed her way amongst them. So did I. She spoke to one or two, but nothing came of it. Whom should we come upon, to my intense surprise, but our dairymaid, the one who had taken herself off the previous day. "I hope you will get a better place than you had with me, Susan," said the mater, rather sarcastically. "I hopes as how I shall, Mrs.," was the insolent retort. "'Twould be hard to do, anyway. That won't, with that there overbearing Molly and yourn." We went on. A great hulking farmer, as big as a giant, and looking as though he had taken more than was good for him in the morning, came lumbering along, pushing every one right and left. He threw his bold eyes on one of the girls. "What place be for you, my lass?" "None o' yourn, master," was the prompt reply. The voice was good-natured and pleasant, and I looked at the girl as the man went shouldering on. She wore a clean light cotton gown, a smart shawl all the colors of the rainbow, and a straw bonnet covered with sky-blue bows. Her face was fairer than most of the faces around. Her eyes were the color of her ribbons, and her mouth, rather wide and always smiling, had about the nicest set of teeth I ever saw. To take likes and dislikes at first sight without rhyme or reason is what I am hopelessly given to, and there's no help for it. People laugh mockingly, as you have heard me say. "There goes Johnny with his fancies again," they cry, but I know that it has served me well through life. I took a liking to this girl's face. It was an honest face, as full of smiles as the bonnet was of bows. Mrs. Todditley noticed her too, and halted. The girl dropped a curtsy. "What place are you seeking?" she asked. "Dairymaids, please, ma'am." The good mater stood, doubtful whether to pursue inquiries or to pass onwards. She liked the face of the girl, but did not like the profusion of blue ribbons. "I understand my work well, ma'am, please, and I'm not afraid of any much of it in reason." This turned the scale. Mrs. Todditley stood her ground and plunged into questioning. "Where have you been living?" "At Mr. Thorpe's farm, please, near Severnstoke." "For how long?" 12 months, please. I went there old Michaelmas Day last year." "Why are you leaving?" "Please, ma'am, a pause here. Please, I wanted a change, and the work was a great sight of it. Frightful heavy, and Mrs. often cross. Quite a herd o' milkers there was there." "What is your name?" "Grizzle Clay. I be strong and healthy, please, ma'am, and I was 22 in the summer." "Can you have a character for Mrs. Thorpe?" "Yes, please, ma'am, and a good one. She can't say nothing against me." And so the queries went on. One would have thought the mater was hiring a whole regiment of soldiers. Grizzle was ready and willing to enter on her place at once, if hired. Mrs. Thorpe was in Worcester that day, and might be seen at the Hare and Hounds Inn. "What do you think, Johnny?" whispered the mater. "I should hire her. She's just a girl I wouldn't mind taking without any character. With those blue bows." "Don't be simple, Johnny. Still, I like the girl, and may as well see Mrs. Thorpe. By the way, though," she added, turning to Grizzle, "what wages do you ask?" 8 pounds, please, ma'am, replied Grizzle, after some hesitation, and with reddening cheeks. 8 pounds, exclaimed Mrs. Todditly. That's very high, but you'll find me a good servant, ma'am. We went back through the town to the Hare and Hounds, and in near the cathedral. Mrs. Thorpe, a substantial dame in a long cloth skirt and black hat, by which we saw she had come in on horseback, was at dinner. She gave Grizzle Clay a good character, saying the girl was honest, clean, hard-working, and very sweet-tempered. And in truth, she was rather sorry to part with her. Mrs. Todditly asked about the blue bows. Mrs. Thorpe said, that was Grizzle Clay's great fault, a love of finery, and she recommended Mrs. Todditly to keep her under in that respect. In going out, we found Grizzle waiting under the archway, having come down to learn her fate. Mrs. Todditly said she should engage her, and bade her follow us to the hotel. It's an excellent character, Johnny, she said, as we went along the street. I like everything about the girl, except the blue ribbons. I don't see any harm in blue ribbons. A girl looks nicer in ribbons than without them. That's just it, said the mater. And this girl is good-looking enough to do without them. Johnny, if Mr. Todditly has no objection, I think we had better take her back in the carriage. You won't mind her sitting by you? Not I. And I'm sure I shall not mind the ribbons. So it was arranged. The girl was engaged to go back with us in the afternoon. Her box would be sent on by the carrier. She presented herself at the Star at the time of starting with a small bundle and a little bird cage, something like a mouse trap that had a bird in it. Could I be let take it, ma'am? She asked of Mrs. Todditly. It's only a poor linnet that I found hurt on the ground the last morning. I went out to help milk Thorpe's cows. I may try, please, to nurse it back to health. Take it, and welcome, cried the squire. The bird had better die, though, than be kept to live in that cage. I was thinking to let it fly, please, sir, when it's strong again. Grizzle had proper notions. She screwed herself into the corner of the seat, so as not to touch me. I heard all about her as we went along. She had gone to live at her Uncle Clay's in Gloucestershire when her mother died, working for them as a servant. The uncle was well-to-do, rented 20 acres of land, and had 2 cows and some sheep and pigs of his own. The aunt had a nephew, and this young man wanted to court her, Grizzle, but she'd have nothing to say to him. It made matters uncomfortable, and last year they turned her out. So she went and hired herself at Mrs. Thorpe's. Well, I should have thought you had better be married and have a home of your own than go out as dairymaid, Grizzle. That depends upon who the husband is, sir, she said, laughing slightly. I'd rather be a dairymaid to the end o' my days. I'd rather be a prisoner in a cage like this poor bird than have anything to say to that there nephew of aunt's. He had red hair, and I can't abide it. Grizzle proved to be a good servant, and became a great favorite in the house, except with Molly. Molly, never taking to her kindly, was for quarreling 10 times a day, but the girl only laughed back again. She was superior to the general run of dairymaids, both in looks and manners, and her good-humored face brought sweethearts up in plenty. 2 of them were serious. The one was George Roper, bailiff's man on a neighboring farm. The other was Sandy Lett, a wheelwright in business for himself at Churchdykely. Of course matters ran in this case, as they generally do run in such cases, all cross and contrary, or, as the French say, a torti à travers. George Roper, a good-looking young fellow with curly hair and a handsome pair of black whiskers, had not a coin beyond the weekly wages he worked for. He had not so much as a chair to sit in, or a turn-up bedstead to lie on. Yet Grizzle loved him with her whole heart. Sandy Lett, who was not bad-looking either, and had a good home and a good business, she did not care for. Of course, the difficulty lay in deciding which of the 2 to choose. Ambition and her friends recommended Sandy Lett. Imprudence in her own heart, George Roper. Like the donkey between the 2 bundles of hay, Grizzle was unable to decide on either, and kept both the swains on the tenterhooks of suspense. Sunday afternoons were the great trouble of Grizzle's life. Roper had holiday then, and came, and Lett, whose time was his own, though of course he could not afford to waste it on a weekday, also came. One would stand at the stile in one field, the other at a stile in another field. And Grizzle, arrayed in one of the light print gowns she favored, the many-colored shawl, and the dangerous blue ribbon bonnet, did not dare to go out to either, lest the other should pounce upon his rival. and a fight ensue. It was getting quite exciting in the household to watch the progress of events. Spring passed, the summer came round, and between the two, Grizzle had her hands full. The other servants could not imagine what the men saw in her. "It is those blue ribbons she's so fond of," said Mrs. Todditley to us two with a sigh. "I doubted them from the first." "I should say it is the blue eyes," dissented Todd. "And I the white teeth and laughing face. Nobody can help liking her." "You shut up, Johnny. If I were Roper." "Shut up yourself, Joseph. Both of you shut up. You know nothing about it," interrupted the squire, who had seemed to be asleep in his chair. "It comes of woman's coquetry and man's folly. As to these two fellows, if Grizzle can't make up her mind, I'll warn them both to keep off my grounds at their peril." One evening during the midsummer holidays, in turning out of the oak walk to cross the fold yard, I came upon Grizzle leaning on the gate. She had a bunch of sweet peas in her hand and tears in her eyes. George Roper, who must have been talking to her, passed me quickly, touching his hat. "Good evening, sir." "Good evening, Roper." He walked away with his firm, quick stride, a well-made, handsome, trustworthy fellow. His brown velveteen coat, an old one of his master's, was shabby, but he looked well in it, and his gaitered legs were straight and strong. That he had been the donor of the sweet peas, a rustic lover's favorite offering, was evident. Grizzle attempted to hide them in her gown when she saw me, but was not quick enough, so she was fain to hold them openly in her hand and make believe to be busy with her milk pail. "It's a drop of skim milk I've got over. I was going to take it to the pigs," said she. "What are you crying about?" "Me crying," returned Grizzle. "It's the sun of Sherneen in my eyes, sir." "Was it? Look here, Grizzle. Why don't you put an end to this state of bother? You won't be able to milk the cows next. 'Tain't any in'ard bother, that sort as LL keep me from doing my proper work," returned she, with a flick to the handle of the pail. "At any rate, you can't marry two men. You would be taken up by old Jones the constable, you know, and tried for bigamy. And I'm sure you must keep them in ferment." George Roper's gone off with a queer look on his face. "Take him, or dismiss him." "I'd take him tomorrow, but for one thing," avowed the girl in a half-whisper. "His short wages, I suppose, 16 shillings a week." 16 shillings a week short wages," echoed Grizzle. "I call 'em good wages, sir. I'd never be afraid of getting along on them with a steady man, and Roper's that. It ain't the wages, Master Johnny. It is that I promised mother never to begin life upon less than a cottage and some things in it." "How do you mean?" "Poor mother was a-dying, sir. Her illness lasted her many a week, and she might be said to be a-dying all the time. I was 18 then. 'Grizzy,' says she to me one night, 'you be a likely girl, and LL get chose afore you be many summers older. But you must promise me that you'll not, on no temptation whatsoever, say yes to a man till he has a home of his own to take you to, and beds and tables and things comfortable about him. Once begin without him, and you and him, LL, spend all your after life looking out for him. But they'll not come any the more for that. And you'll be at 6s and 7s always. And him, why perhaps he'll take to the beer shop, for many a man does, through having, so to say, no home. I've seen the ill of it in my days," she says, "and if I thought you'd tumble into it, I'd hardly rest quiet in the grave where you be so soon a-going to place me." "Be at ease, mother," says I to her in answer, "and take my promise, which I'll never break, not to set up for marriage without a home my own and proper things in it. That promise I can't break, Master Johnny, and there is laid the root of the trouble all along. I saw then, Roper had nothing but a lodging, not a stick or stone that he could call his own. And the foolish man, instead of saving up out of his wages, spent the remnant in buying pretty things for Grizzle. It was a hopeless case. You should never have had anything to say to Roper, knowing this, Grizzle." Grizzle twirled the sweet peas round and round in her fingers, and looked foolish, answering nothing. "Lud has a good home to give you and means to keep it going. He must make a couple of pounds a week, perhaps more, but then I don't care for him, Master Johnny. Give him up then. Send him about his business." She might have been counting the blossoms on the sweet pea stalks. Presently she spoke, without looking up. "You see, Master Johnny, one does not like to lose all one's chances and grow into an old maid. And if I can't have Roper, perhaps, in time, I might bring myself to take let. It's a better opportunity than a poor dairymaid like me could ever looked for. The cat was out of the bag. Grizzle was keeping let on for a remote contingency. When she could make up her mind to say no to Roper, she meant to say yes to him. It is awful treachery to Roper. Keeping him on only to drop him at last, ran my thoughts. Were I he, I should give her a good shaking, and leave. A sudden movement on Grizzle's part startled me. Catching up her pail, she darted across the yard by the pond as fast as her pattens would go, poured the milk into the pig trough with a dash, and disappeared indoors. Looking round for any possible cause for this, I caught sight of a man in light fustian clothes hovering about in the field by the hayricks. It was Sandy Lett. He had walked over on the chance of getting to see her, but she did not come out again. The next move in the drama was made by Lett. The following Monday he presented himself before the squire, dressed in his Sunday-going things and a new hat on, to ask him to be so good as to settle the matter, for it was getting almost beyond him. "Why, how can I settle it?" demanded the squire. "What have I to do with it? It's a tormenting of me pretty nigh in a fiddle strings," pleaded Lett. "What with her caprices, for sometimes her speaks to me as pleasant as an angel, while at others her won't speak nohow, and what with that drat folk over yonder a teasing of me," jerking his head in the direction of Church Dykeley, "I don't get no peace of my life. It be a shame, squire, for any woman to treat a man as she's treating me. I can't make her have you if she won't have you," exploded the squire, not liking the appeal. "It is said, you know, that she would rather have Roper." Sandy Lett, who had a great idea of his own merits, turned his nose up in the air. "Beg pardon, squire," he said, "but that won't wash, that won't. Grizzle couldn't have nothing serious to say to that there Roper. Not but a day laborer on a farm. She couldn't. And if he don't keep his distance from her, I'll wring his ugly head round for him. Look at me beside him. My good home, why, it's mahogany furniture it. I can keep her amos like a lady. She may have a wench once a week for the washing and scrubbing, if she likes. I'd not deny her nothing in reason. And for that there Roper to think to put hisself atween us. No, 'tunt do. The moon's not made o' green cheese. Grizzle's a bit light-hearted, sir, fond o' chatter, and Roper he played upon that. But if you'd speak a word for me, squire, so as I may have the banns put up, what the deuce, do you suppose I have to do with my women servants and their banns?" testily interrupted the squire. "I can't interfere to make her marry you, but I'll tell you thus much, and her too. If there is to be this perpetual uproar about Grizzle, she shall quit my house before the 12-month she engaged herself for is up. And that's a disgrace for any young woman. So Sandy Lett got nothing by coming, poor unfortunate man. And yet, in a sense he did. The squire ordered the girl before him, and told her in a sharp, decisive tone that she must either put an end to the state of things, or leave his service. And Grizzle, finding that the limit of toleration had come, but unable in her conflicting difficulties to decide which of the swains to retain and which discard, dismissed the two. After that, she was plunged over head and ears in distress, and for a week could hardly see to skim off the cream for her tears. "This comes of hiring dairy wenches at a statty fair," cried wrathful Molly. The summer went on. August was waning. One morning when Mr. Duffham had called in and was helping Mrs. Todditley to give Lena a spoonful of jam with a powder in it, at which Lena kicked and screamed, Grizzle ran into the room in excitement so great that they thought she was going into a fit. "Why, what is it?" questioned Mrs. Todditley, with a temporary truce to the jam hostilities. "Has either of the cows kicked you down, Grizzle?" I'm coming to a fordin'," shrieked Grizzle hysterically, laughing and crying in the same breath. Mr. Duffham put her into a chair, angrily ordering her to be calm, for anger is the best remedy in the world to apply to hysterics, and took a letter from her that she held out. It told her that her Uncle Clay was dead, and had left her a bequest of £40. The £40 to be paid to her in gold whenever she should go and apply for it. This letter had come by the morning post, but Grizzle, busy in her dairy, had only just now opened it. For the poor old uncle to have died in June, and them never to let me hear on't, she said, sobbing. "Just like him? And me never to have put on a bit mourning for him." She rose from the chair, drying her eyes with her apron, and held out her hand for the letter. As Mrs. Todditley began to say she was very glad to hear of her good luck, a shy look and a half-smile came into the girl's face. "I can get the home now, ma'am, with all this fortin," she whispered. Molly banged her pans about worse than ever, partly in envy at the good luck of the girl, partly because she had to do the dairy work during Grizzle's absence in Gloucestershire, a day and a half, which was given her by Mrs. Todditley. "There won't be no standing anigh her and her finery now," cried rampant Molly to the servants. "She'll tack her blue ribbons onto her tail, as well as her head. Lucky if the dairy some fine day ain't found turned all sour." Grizzle came back in time, bringing her 40 pounds in gold wrapped up in the foot of a folded stocking. The girl had as much sense as one here and there, and a day or two after her arrival, she asked leave to speak to her mistress. It was to say that she should like to leave at the end of her year, Michaelmas, if her mistress would please look out for someone to replace her. "And what are you going to do, Grizzle, when you do leave? What are your plans?" Grizzle turned the color of a whole cornfield of poppies and confessed that she was going to be married to George Roper. "Oh," said Mrs. Todditley, but she had nothing to urge against it. "And please, ma'am," cried Grizzle, the poppies deepening and glowing, "we'd like to make bold to ask if the master would let to us that bit of a cottage that the Claytons have went out of." The mater was quite taken aback. It seemed indeed that Grizzle had been laying her plans to some purpose. "It have a nice piece o' ground to grow potatoes and garden stuff, and it have a pigsty," said Grizzle. "Please, ma'am, we shall get along famous if we can have that." "Do you mean to set up a pig, Grizzle?" Grizzle's face was all one smile. Of course they did. With such a fortune as she had come into, she intended herself and her husband to have everything good about them, including a pig. "I'll give Grizzle away," wrote Todd when he heard the news of the legacy and the projected marriage. "It will be fun, and if you people at home don't present her with her wedding gown, it will be a stingy shame. Let it have a good share of blue bows." "No, though, will he?" exclaimed Grizzle with sparkling eyes when told of the honor designed her by Todd. "Give me away. Him. I've always said there's not such another gentleman in these parts as Mr. Joseph." The banns were put up, and matters progressed smoothly, with one solitary exception. When Sandy let heard of the treason going on behind his back, he was ready to drop with blighted love and mortification. A 3 days' weather blight was nothing to his. Quite forgetting modesty, he made his fierce way into the house, without saying with your leave or by your leave, and thence to the dairy where Grizzle stood making up butter, startling the girl so much with his white face and wild eyes that she stepped back into a pan of cream. Then he enlarged upon her iniquity, and wound up by assuring her that neither she nor her coward of a Roper could ever come to good. After that, he left her alone, making no further stir. Grizzle quitted the manor and went into the cottage, which the squire had agreed to let to them. Roper was to come to it on the wedding day. A daughter of Goody Pickers, one Mary Standish, whose husband had a habit of going off on roving trips and staying away until found and brought back by the parish, stayed with Grizzle, helping her to put the cottage in habitable order and arrange in it the articles she bought. That sum of 40 pounds seemed to be doing wonders. I told Grizzle I could not have made 1,000 go as far. "Any left, Master Johnny?" "Why, of course I shall have plenty left," she said. "After buying the bed and the set o' drawers and the chairs and tables, and the pots and pans and crockeryware for the kitchen, and the pig and a cock and hen or two, and providing a joint of roast pork and some best tea and white sugar for the wedding day, we shall still have pounds and pounds on't left. 'Tisn't me, sir, nor George nether, that you d like to lavish away all we've got and put none by for a rainy day. All right, Grizzle, I'm going to give you a tea caddy." "Well now, to think of that, Master Johnny," she said, lifting her hands. "And after the mistress giving me such a handsome gown, and the servants clubbing together, and bringing a roasting oven and beautiful set o' flat irons. Roper, and me'll be set up like a king and queen. On Saturday, the day before that fixed for the wedding, I and Todd were passing the cottage, a kind of miniature barn to look at with a thatched roof and a broken grindstone at the door, and went in, rather to the discomfiture of Grizzle and Mrs. Standish, who had their petticoats shortened and their arms bare, scouring and scrubbing and making ready for the morrow. Returning across the fields later, we saw Grizzle at the door, gazing out all ways at once. "Consulting the stars as to whether it will be fine tomorrow, Grizzle?" cried Todd, who was never at a loss for a ready word. "I was looking out for Mary Standish, sir," she said. "George Roper haven't been here tonight, and we be all at doubtings about several matters he was to have come in to settle. First he said he'd go on betimes to the church o' Sunday morning. Then he said he'd come here, and we'd all walk together. And it was left at a uncertainty. There's the blackberry pie, too, that he've not brought." "The blackberry pie," said I. "One that Mrs. Dodd, where he lodges, have made a present of to us for dinner, Master Johnny. Roper was to haul brought it in tonight ready. It won't look well to see him carrying of a baked pie on a Sunday morning when he've got on his wedding coat. I can't think where he have got to." At this moment, someone was seen moving towards us across the field path. It proved to be Mary Standish. Her gown turned up over her head, and a pie in her hands the size of a pulpit cushion. Red syrup was running down the outside of the dish, and the crust looked a little black at the edges. "My, what a big beauty!" exclaimed Grizzle. "Do take it, Grizzle, for my hands be all cramped with its weight," said Mrs. Standish, who, as it turned out, had been over to Roper's lodgings 1.5 miles away with a view to seeing what had become of the bridegroom-elect. And she nearly threw the pie into Grizzle's arms and took down her gown. "And what do Roper say?" asked Grizzle. "And why have he not been here?" "Roper's not at home," said Mary Standish. "He come in from work about 6, washed and put hisself to rights a bit, and then went out with a big bundle. Mrs. Dodd called after him to bring the pie, but he called back again that the pie might wait." "What was in the bundle?" questioned Grizzle, resenting the slight shown to the pie. "Well, by the looks on't, Mother Dodd thought 'twas his working clothes packed up," replied Mary Standish. "His working clothes!" cried Grizzle. "They're going to take him to the tailor's, maybe to get him done up, and not afore they wanted it." "Why, it's spending money for nothing," was Grizzle's comment. "I could ha' done up them clothes." "Well, it's what Mother Dodd thought," concluded Mary Standish. We said good night and went racing home, leaving the two women at the door, Grizzle lodging the heavy blackberry pie on the old grindstone. It was a glorious day for Grizzle's wedding. The hour fixed by the clerk, old Bumford, was 10 o'clock, so that it might be got well over before the bell rang out for service. We reached the church early. Amongst the few spectators already there was cross-grained Molly, pocketing her ill temper and for once meaning to be gracious to Grizzle. 10 o'clock struck, and the big old clock went ticking on. Clerk Bumford, a pompous man when free from gout, began abusing the wedding party for not keeping its time. The 1/4 was striking when Grizzle came up with Mary Standish and a young girl. She looked white and nervous and not at all at ease in her bridal attire, a green gown of some kind of stuff, and no end of pink ribbons, the choice of colors being Grizzle's own. "Is Roper here yet?" whispered Mary Standish. "Not yet. It's too bad of him," she continued, "never to send a body word whether he meant to call for us or not, and us a-waiting there till now, expecting of him. But where was George Roper?" And, as old Bumford asked, what did he mean by it? The clergyman in his surplice and had looked out at the vestry twice, as if questioning what the delay meant. We stood just inside the porch, and Grizzle grew whiter and whiter. "Just a few minutes more o' this delay, and there won't be no wedding at all this blessed morning," announced Clerk Bumford for the public benefit. "George Roper wants a good blowing up, he do." Ere the words were well spoken, a young man named Dicker, who was a fellow lodger of Roper's and was to have accompanied him to church, made his appearance alone. That something had gone wrong was plainly to be seen. But what with the publicity of his present position, and what with the stern clerk pouncing down upon him in wrath, the young man could hardly get his news out. In the first place, Roper had never been home all night, never been seen, in short, since he had left Mrs. Dodd's with the bundle, as related by Mary Standish. That morning, while Dicker in his consternation knew not what to be at, whether to be off to church alone or to wait still in the hope that Roper would come, 2 notes were delivered at Mrs. Dodd's by a strange boy, the one addressed to himself, John Dicker, the other to Miss Clay, meaning Grizzle. They bore ill news. George Roper had given up his marriage and gone away for good. At this extraordinary crisis, pompous Clerk Bumford was so taken aback that he could only open his mouth and stare. It gave Dicker the opportunity to put in a few words. What we thought at Mother Dodd's was that Roper had took a drop too much somewhere last evening and couldn't get home. He's as sober a man as can be. But whatever else was we to think? And when this writed note come this morning, and we found he had gone off to America o' purpose to avoid being married, we was downright floundered. "This is yours, Grizzle," added the young man in as gently considerate a tone as any gentleman could have used. Grizzle's hand shook as she took the letter he held out. She was biting her pale lips hard to keep down emotion. "Take it and read it," she whispered to Mary Standish, for in truth she herself could not, with all that sea of curious eyes upon her. But Mary Standish labored under the slight disadvantage of not being able to read writing. Conscious of this difficulty, she would not touch the letter. Mr. Bumford, his senses and his tongue returning together, snatched it without ceremony out of Grizzle's hand. "I'll read it," said he. And he did so. "And I, Johnny Ludlow, give you the copy verbatim. Der Grizzle, Saturday evening. This comes hoppin' UBWL as it leaves me at present, which this is to declare to you, der Grizzle, that our marriage is at an end. It have been too much for me and preyed on my sperits. I can't stand it no longer nohow, and have took my leave of you for iver. Der Grizzle, I max my best way this night to Liverpool to tack ship for America. And my last hops for you Harby sprest is as you may be happy with another. I were niver worthy of you, der Grizzle, and that's a F.A. but I kep it. From you till now, when I can't kep it no longer cause of my conscience. Once you have read this here letter, don't you niver think no more on me again, which I shan't on you. Adieu for iver. Your unfortunate friend, George Roper. I'd av cared acros at the Blackbird Pie, but shout have been delayed. My good hops is you'll enjoy the pie with another better, nor you iver could along with me. Best farewell wishes to Mary Standish. Gr. What with the penmanship and what with the spelling, it took old Bumford's spectacles some time to get through. A thunderbolt could hardly have made more stir than this news. No one spoke, however, and Mr. Bumford folded the letter in silence. "I always knowed what that there Roper was worth," broke forth Molly. "He pipe-clayed my best black cloak on the sly one day when I ordered him off the premises. You be better without him, Grizzle girl, and here's my hand and wishing you better luck in token of it." Mrs. Dodd was right. Then was a change of clothes he was a-taking with him to America, added Mary Standish. "Roper's a jailbird, I should say," put in old Bumford. "A nice un, too. But what can it be that's went wrong? What is it that have took him off?" wondered the young man, Dicker. The parson in his surplice had come down the aisle and was standing to listen. Grizzle, in the extremity of mental bitterness and confusion, but striving to put a face of indifference on the matter before the public, gazed around helplessly. "I'm better without him, as Molly says. And what do I care?" she cried recklessly, her lips quivering. The parson put his hand gravely on her arm. "My good young woman, I think you are in truth better without him. Such a man as that is not worthy of a regret." "No, sir, and I don't and won't regret him," was her rapid answer, the voice rising hysterically. As she turned, intending to leave the church, she came face to face with Sandy Lett. I had seen him standing there, drinking in the words of the note with all his ears and taking covert looks at Grizzle. "Don't pass me by, Grizzle," said he. "I feel hearty sorry for all this, and I hope that villain'll come to be drowned on his way to America. Let me be your friend. I'll make you a good one." "Thank you," she answered. "Please let me go by." "Look here, Grizzle," he rejoined with a start, as if some thought had at that moment occurred to him. "Why shouldn't you and me make it up together? Now, if the one bridegroom's been a wicked renegade and left you all forsaken, you see another here ready to put on his shoes. Do, Grizzle, do." "Do what?" she asked, not taking his meaning. "Let's be married, Grizzle. You and me. There's the parson and Mr. Bumford all ready, and we can get it over afore church begins. It's a good home I gotta take you to. Don't say nay, my girl. Now what should Grizzle do? Like the lone lorn widow in David Copperfield, who, when a ship's carpenter offered her marriage, instead of saying, "Thank you, sir, I'd rather not," up with a bucket of water and dashed it over him, Grizzle up with her hand and dealt Mr. Sandy a sounding smack on his left cheek. Smarting under the infliction, Sandy Lett gave vent to a word or two of passion, out of place in a church, and the parson administered a reprimand. Grizzle had not waited. Before the sound of her hand had died away, she was outside the door, quickly traversing the lonely churchyard. A fine end to poor Grizzle's wedding. The following day, Monday, Mrs. Todditley went over to the cottage. Grizzle, sitting with her hands before her, started up and made believe to be desperately busy with some teacups. We were all sorry for her. Mr. Todditley has been making inquiry into this business, Grizzle, said the mater, and it certainly seems more mysterious than ever, for he cannot hear a word against Roper. His late master says Roper was the best servant he ever had. He is as sorry to lose him as can be. Oh, ma'am, but he's not worth troubling about. My thanks and duty to the master all the same. Would you mind letting me see Roper's note? Grizzle took it out of the tea caddy I had given her, which caddy was to have been kept for show. Mrs. Todditley, mastering the contents, and biting her lips to suppress an occasional smile, sat in thought. I suppose this is Roper's own handwriting, Grizzle? Oh, ma'am, it's his safe enough. Not that I ever saw him write. He talks about the blackberry pie, you see. One might know it is his by that. Then, judging by what he says here, he must have got into some bad conduct, or trouble, I think, which he has been clever enough to keep from you and the world. Oh yes, that's it, said Grizzle. Poor mother used to say one might be deceived in a saint. Well, it's a pity, but he had given some clue to its nature. It would have been a sort of satisfaction. But now, I chiefly came over to ask you, Grizzle, what you purpose to do. There's only one thing for me now, ma'am, returned poor, crestfallen Grizzle. After a pause, I must get another place. Will you come back to the manor? A hesitation, a struggle, and then she flung her apron up to her face and burst into tears. Dairymaids have their feelings as well as their betters, and Grizzle's lines were very bitter just then. She had been so proud of this poor cottage home. She had grown to love it so in only those few days, and to look forward to years of happiness within it in their humble way, and now to find that she must give it up and go to service again. The squire says he will consider it as though you and Roper had not taken the cottage, and he thinks he can find someone to rent it who will buy the furniture of you. That is, if you prefer to sell it, she resumed very kindly. And I think you had better come back to us, Grizzle. The new maid in your place does not suit at all. Grizzle took down her apron and rubbed her eyes. It's very good of you, ma'am, and of the master, and I'd like to come back only for one thing. I'm afraid Molly would let me have no peace in my life. She'd get tanking at me about Roper before the others. Perhaps I'd hardly be able to stand it. I will talk to her, said Mrs. Todditley, rising to leave. Where is Mary Standish today? Gone over to Ulster, ma'am. She had an errand there, she said, but I think it was only to tell her folks the tale of my trouble. Molly had her talking to at once. It put her out a little, for she was really feeling some pity for Grizzle and did not at all intend to get tanking at her. Molly had once experienced a similar disappointment herself, and her heart was opening to Grizzle. After her dinner was served that evening, she ran over to the cottage, in her coarse cooking apron and without a bonnet. Look here, she said, bursting in upon Grizzle, sitting alone in the dusk. You come back to your place if you like. The missus says she has given you the option, and don't you be afeard of me. 'Tisn't me as'll ever give back to you a word about Roper. And mind, when I says a thing, I mean it. Thank you, Molly, humbly replied poor Grizzle, catching her breath. The sooner you come back, the better, continued Molly, fiercely. For it's not me and that wench we've got now as is going to stop together. I had to call the missus into the dairy this blessed morning and show her the state it was in. So you'll come back, Grizzle, and we'll be glad to see you. Grizzle nodded her head. Her heart was too full to speak. And as to that false villain of a Roper, as could serve a woman such a pitiful trick, I only wish I had the doctoring of him. He should get a— Molly's voice, pitched in a high tone, died gradually away. What on earth was it, stepping in upon them? Some most extraordinary object, who opened the door softly and came in with a pitch. Molly peered at it in the darkness with open mouth. A cry from Grizzle, a cry half of terror, half of pain, for she had recognized the object to be a man and George Roper. George Roper with his hair and handsome whiskers cut off and white sleeves in his brown coat, so that he looked like a Merry Andrew. He seemed 3 parts stupefied, not at all like a traveler in condition to set off to America. Sinking into the nearest wooden chair, he stared at Grizzle in a dazed way and spoke in a slow, questioning, wondering voice. "I can't think what it is that's the matter with me." "Where be your whiskers? And your hair?" burst forth Molly. The man gazed at her for a minute or two, taking in the question gradually. He then raised his trembling hand to either side his face, feeling for the whiskers that were no longer there. "A nice pot o' mischief you've been a-getting into," cried sharp Molly. "Is that your own coat? What's gone of the sleeves?" For, now that the coat could be seen closely, it turned out that its sleeves had been cut out, leaving the bare, white shirt sleeves underneath. Roper looked first at one arm, then at the other. "What part of America be you bound for? And when do the ship sail?" pursued sarcastic Molly. The man opened his mouth and closed it again, like a born natural, as Molly put it. Grizzle suddenly clung to him with a sobbing cry. "He is ill, Molly. He's ill. He has had some trick played on him. George, what be it?" But still George Roper only gazed about him as if too stupid to understand. In short, the man was stupid. That is, he had been stupefied, and as yet was only partially recovering its effects. He remembered going into the barber shop on Saturday night to have his hair cut, after leaving his bundle of clothes at the tailor's. Some ale was served round at the barber's, and he, Roper, took a glass. After that he remembered nothing. All was blank, until he woke up an hour ago in the unused shed at the back of the blacksmith's shop. That the ale had been badly drugged was evident. The question arose, who had played the trick? In a day or two, when Roper had recovered, an inquiry was set on foot, but nothing came of it. The barber testified that Roper seemed sleepy after the ale, and a joke went round that he must have been drinking some previously. He went out of the shop without having his hair cut, with several more men, and that was all the barber knew. Of course, Sandy Let was suspected. People said he had done it in hope to get himself substituted as bridegroom. Let, however, vowed through thick and thin that he was innocent, and nothing was traced home to him. Neither was the handwriting of the note. They were married on the Thursday. Grizzle was too glad to get him back unharmed to make bones about the shorn whiskers. No difficulty was made about opening the church on a weekday. Clerk Bumford grumbled at it, but the parson put him down, and the blackberry pie served still for the wedding dinner.